Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first ever ACLU of Minnesota office hour. I am the communications assistant, Michaela Sharp, and I will be interviewing our legal director, Teresa Nelson. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to her.
Thanks, Michaela, and thanks everyone for joining us. I guess I'm the guinea pig for this new program, and hopefully it goes well. I want to start with just a quick update. So the ACLU staff is working remotely, but we are still working. We are still all hands on deck. And in addition to our regular legal caseload, we are working hard to get people out of custody in jails and prisons. We sent letters to the governor, to the courts, to sheriffs, to police chiefs, and urging all of them to do their part to make sure that people aren't locked up in jails where the threat of COVID-19 is especially problematic. We are also working on advocacy around the police enforcement of the stay-home order and so many other things. And so we know you have lots of questions, so I think we'll start answering those.
Let's start. Okay. Is it constitutional for the stay-at-home order to effectively bar people from attending religious services in person? Does this unduly interfere with our freedom of religion?
You know, the stay-home order certainly limits our movement and limits the ability of people to assemble and worship together. The First Amendment and our Minnesota Constitution both protect the right to free exercise of religion. And so this does infringe on that ability to freely exercise our religion. Now, under the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in 1990 called Employment Division versus Smith, the U.S. Supreme Court said that neutral, generally applicable laws that have an incidental burden on religion don't violate the First Amendment and the right to free exercise. So the stay-home order is neutral. It doesn't single out religion. It's generally applicable. It applies to pretty much everybody with some exceptions. And I think it's likely that a court would not find that it violates the First Amendment. Minnesota's Constitution, though, has greater protections. Article 1, Section 16 of the Minnesota Constitution has been held to provide stronger protections than that provided under the First Amendment and the Employment Division versus Smith decision. So under the Minnesota Constitution, a government action that has a substantial burden on the free exercise of religion has to be the least restrictive means of serving a compelling government interest. So let's think about that. So here we do have a compelling interest, right? The governor's interest and the state's interest is in flattening the curve so that this pandemic does not overwhelm our healthcare resources and lead to unnecessary and preventable deaths. That's a pretty compelling interest. And so I think that prong of the test would be met by a challenge to the stay-at-home order. Arguably banning public health gatherings, at least right now, when we know that we haven't reached the peak yet, is probably the least restrictive means of serving that interest. A court looking at a challenge to the stay-home order is going to look at the governor's actions and make sure that they are soundly grounded in science and in public health, and that they're very closely related to what the government says is their compelling interest. Again, the interest here is probably making sure that this pandemic doesn't overload our healthcare system and lead to unnecessary deaths. And so as long as the governor's actions are tied to that public health goal and to scientific knowledge and the science of the spread of this pandemic, I think a court is likely to uphold it.
Okay. The stay-at-home order is currently being justified by data modeling, the details of which are currently being kept from the public. Since the ACLU is calling for government transparency, does that also apply to the data that is justifying the executive order? How can people trust that this justification is reliable and sufficient?
And that's a great follow-up question because, as I just said, the government's actions and restrictions on our constitutional liberties have to be directly related to science and to a scientific justification, a public health justification. And transparency in that process is absolutely critical. If they're relying on data to restrict our movement and restrict our ability to worship collectively, and so many more things that the orders entail, transparency is absolutely critical for that. Now, some states have done better than others in transparency. The state of Minnesota has created a page that provides much of the details about the modeling that they've done. And if you haven't seen it, it's at mn.gov/COVID-19/data/modeling. And it does have a PDF that has technical documentation. It has some slides that explains the modeling. This is really complicated stuff, and I don't pretend to be an expert, and I don't pretend to know if this is adequate, but certainly a court would dig deep and look at the actual science, and they would need an expert to explain, an independent expert to explain why this science and this modeling is appropriate and accurate. We absolutely encourage the state to continue providing as much transparency as possible for modeling, and allow others to pick it apart and criticize it. And we all need to be able to trust those decisions. So absolutely, transparency is critical.
Speaking of transparency, I just want to remind everyone that we collected a lot of these questions from the comments, DMs, and really what we've heard are your concerns about coronavirus and Minnesota. So here's the next one. While the current executive order ostensibly has an end date, the ease with which it has already been extended makes it clear that the started end date is arbitrary and meaningless. Should the ACLU not be pressuring Governor Walz for restrictions on his ability to extend the current order indefinitely?
So to answer that question, I think it's helpful to look at the broader context for the governor's authority. The governor's ability to declare a peacetime emergency is spelled out in statute, and it was a statute that was adopted by our legislature through the legislative process. And the law does allow him to declare a peacetime state of emergency, and it gives him general direction and control of emergency management. So his authority to act is very broad, and unlimited, indefinite authority is absolutely troubling to the ACLU and should be troubling to every member of the community. At the same time, though, his authority, even though it's broad, it's not unlimited. Again, his actions still have to comply with the Constitution, and to the extent that his actions don't meet some of the high levels of scrutiny that the court applies when our liberties are being infringed, then a court could overturn some of those actions. And he also doesn't get to unilaterally extend his emergency powers. A lot of people don't realize this, but when the governor declares a peacetime emergency, the statute says that it can last only 5 days unless the executive council extends it for up to 30 days. And the executive council is made up of all of the constitutionally elected officers. So that's the governor, the lieutenant governor, secretary of state, state auditor, and the attorney general. They all have to agree on extending it for up to 30 days. And then after that 30 days, the legislature can terminate the emergency by a majority vote of each house. So there is a check on his authority, and that is first the executive council and then the legislature. And you might ask, well, what happens if the governor declares a peacetime emergency when the legislature is not in session to shut it down? The law actually requires the governor to convene the legislature if they're not in session, and if they don't, if he or she wants to extend it beyond the 30 days. So there are some checks in the authority. And again, as this emergency moves forward and progresses, what we're looking for is making sure that the governor's actions, the state's actions, are grounded in public health and in science, and not, politically motivated or a knee-jerk reaction.
Thank you. This question's a bit long. So the Star Tribune is reporting that 25 people have been charged with violating Minnesota's stay-at-home order. Is this constitutional? What are your concerns about people being charged with this order? And how can the state enforce the order? And how can they ensure enforcement is fair?
So I'll start with the question, is this constitutional? I'm not a judge, so I don't have the power to declare something constitutional or not, but I can tell you what a court is going to be looking for when there's an inevitable challenge to these charges. First, the court is going to assess whether criminal penalties pass strict scrutiny, but whether they pass, whether it's the least restrictive means of serving a compelling government interest. And so in this context, the question is, are criminal penalties for violating the stay-at-home order the least restrictive means of serving the government's compelling interest in flattening the curve on COVID-19? I think that could vary depending on the circumstances. And if you have somebody who has repeatedly violated the stay-at-home order, somebody who is putting other folks at risk, I think it might be more likely that a court would say that, yes, criminal penalty is the least restrictive means in this case. A court is also going to look at the stay-at-home order itself to make sure that it has enough detail and clarity to provide adequate notice to people so that they know what conduct is a crime. The right to due process under our Constitution requires that people are sufficiently informed about what conduct is prohibited before we face criminal charges. And so that concept is often referred to as a question of whether or not the law is void for vagueness. And so a court is going to look at what a person has been accused of doing and whether or not the stay-at-home order adequately informed that person that what they were doing was illegal. And so those are the two main questions that a court will look at. What are my concerns? What are our concerns about people being charged with the order? We have a few concerns. First, we're concerned that violations of the order are going to fall disproportionately on marginalized people, on poor people, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, people with disabilities. And we are concerned that we'll see that through police racial profiling, through unlawful stops of people for being out and about without really any other details or any other information to make police even think that somebody is violating the stay-at-home order versus going to the grocery store. And so we're very concerned about the possibility for disproportionate enforcement. And we're also concerned about a trend that we've been seeing in the current list of charges is of police just piling on this additional misdemeanor charge when somebody's arrested and charged with other crimes. We've urged the government to make compliance as voluntary as possible and only pursue criminal charges when it's absolutely necessary. So when somebody's being brought to jail already because they're alleged to have committed a serious crime, tacking on an additional misdemeanor charge doesn't really seem necessary. And so we're concerned about that. And you might think, well, misdemeanor, that's no big deal, but it is a big deal. A misdemeanor on your record can follow you throughout your life, potentially impacting your ability to get housing, your ability to get work. And so it does make a difference. And then third, how can the state enforce the order and how can they ensure enforcement is fair? I think, like what we've said, police should be enforcing this and trying to make compliance as voluntary as possible. So that means providing education to folks when they see people who are likely violating the order and explaining to them the reasons for it and encouraging them to go home. In the long term, that education actually is going to be critical because some people might not understand it and might not recognize the importance of complying with the order. And voluntary compliance, talking to somebody once, could prevent future violations. In other contexts, police issue warnings all the time for speeding, for transit fare evasion, and they can do so in this context as well. So ensuring that enforcement is done fairly, one key element that is required for fairness is to make sure that we are collecting and analyzing race data. Just this week, the ACLU nationally released a report on marijuana possession enforcement that identified widespread racial disparities. And if we didn't have the data on who was being arrested for marijuana, we wouldn't be able to identify those disparities and start trying to remedy that unfair enforcement. And here in the Twin Cities Metro for marijuana, Black people are more than 7 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than white people. With the stay-at-home order violations, we have found it very difficult to locate race data about the people who have been cited. It's a small number still, 25 in the state. That's a pretty small number, but unless we have really good data about who's being charged, it's really difficult to make sure that police are enforcing the order fairly. I think I got everything.
Yeah, that was great. That was amazing. And on the same topic, what is the ACLU of Minnesota's position on fines and fees during the pandemic?
Yeah, so members of our community are really struggling. Unless you are fortunate, like the staff of the ACLU, to have a job that you can do from home, people are losing their jobs. We have record unemployment, and people are losing their health insurance at a time when we're most in need of quality health care. People are also in danger of losing their housing if they can't pay their mortgages or rent. And even before this emergency, the ACLU of Minnesota was urging legislators to reform fines and fees. That's all the more critical right now. And just as an example, even before the pandemic, you could have your driver's license suspended if you got a ticket and couldn't pay your fine. And so that still can happen now. But you might still have to drive to your essential job. You might have to, be able to feed your kids and pay your rent. And so not driving isn't an option, especially when transit is limited. So that one unpaid fine can spiral out to more charges, including driving after suspension, driving after revocation. And those negative effects of a single unpaid fine can follow you for years, and they're just amplified right now. So that they're not making the community safer or healthier. And so we have asked, for violations of the stay-at-home order, we've asked the courts to make any fines and fees contingent on ability to pay. And we absolutely need reform on that issue.
Yeah, and we've gotten some pushback from that position, particularly how do you propose to get people to follow laws they don't like if there's no consequences for not following them, like a fine or fee? What should we do?
Sure. I mean, we've never advocated that there be no consequences for not following the law. Our point is that using criminal penalties that will stay with the person potentially for the rest of their lives and could lead to problems retaining housing and employment should only be used if absolutely necessary to gain compliance. By no means should a person be put in jail where we know they cannot maintain adequate physical distancing. It's absolutely impossible in jail. And it really makes little sense to put somebody in jail where they cannot physically distance in order to enforce an order that requires physical distancing. That makes absolutely no sense. And so if we were to base any penalties on ability to pay, that would mean that somebody who can't afford a $50 fine would pay something lower and something that would be meaningful to them, that they could afford. If I got a $50 fine, it would not be that big of a deal for me to pay. But for somebody else, it could mean the difference between housing and no housing. And so, somebody who lacks means should not face a disproportionate consequence for the same conduct.
Good. Speaking of consequences, why were the Liberate Minnesota protesters not charged with violating the stay-at-home order?
So I can't really speak to the motivations of the St. Paul Police Department and their handling of the Liberate Minnesota protest. I think that it does reflect a trend that we're seeing in both the Minneapolis and St. Paul and a lot of other police departments who are approaching violations of the stay-at-home order with voluntary compliance and using a lighter hand, and only using criminal charges to enforce when absolutely necessary. So, you know, I would hope that other protesters for other causes are treated similarly, and that, for example, people who are protesting to gain the release of people who are locked up aren't treated differently than these folks.
And this question is coming directly from the Facebook Live chat. Looking beyond Minnesota to the federal government, does the president have the right to deny stimulus payments to families with mixed immigration status?
Boy, this is a tough question, and it's one that the National ACLU has done some advocacy on, and we have argued that the government should not deny payments to people with mixed immigration status. Nevertheless, they are doing that, and that's really problematic because we know how important immigrants are to our community and to our both to the livelihoods of all of us, and then also just in creating a thriving and vibrant atmosphere and community. And so they're suffering as much as everybody else, and we should be making sure that nobody is left behind. I don't really have a whole lot of expertise on the legal mechanisms that would allow or prohibit the president from denying the stimulus payments, but I can say that it's really wrong, and we should rethink that.
Thank you. And if you have any questions or comments, make sure to drop them in the comments area below, but we're going to keep going. And the next question is, can you explain the Moose Lake lawsuit? Is the ACLU of Minnesota advocating for the release of all prisoners? What are the criteria for release?
Yeah, so we know from public health experts that it's only a matter of time before correctional facilities and jails see cases of COVID-19. And the other thing that we know from public health experts is that once it enters a facility, it's going to spread like wildfire. People can't physically distance when you are locked in a cell with 5, 6 other people. So we're at that spot now at Moose Lake, Minnesota Correctional Facility, Moose Lake. And some people have confused the Moose Lake Prison or Moose Lake Correctional Facility with the Department of Human Services Civil Commitment Program in Moose Lake. Those are different programs, and we are suing the correctional facility. So people who are currently incarcerated and serving their criminal sentences. And multiple cases have been identified. And there was a point where Moose Lake had just abandoned testing and presumed people were positive. And so we sued because the facility wasn't doing enough. There's over 1,000 people incarcerated at Moose Lake, and one of our clients was in a dorm room with 5 other people at least, and physical distancing is absolutely impossible when you've got that many people crammed into very small rooms, very small cells. And so we sued. We filed a class action lawsuit, and we have 2 potential classes of people. One is people who are medically vulnerable. One of our clients fits that category, and he is somebody that the CDC has identified as having a particularly high risk if he gets sick. And then also people who have less than 180 days left on their sentence. We've asked for, right now, the immediate release of our 3 clients. And then we've asked the court to appoint a special master to work on reducing the population to a point where physical distancing is possible and the risk of exposure is minimized. And then we've also asked for recommended changes to other procedures in the facility to keep people safe and keep conditions sanitary. So we're not advocating to open every jail cell and let people out of the facility. That's where a special master will come in handy and be able to assess what releases are appropriate, what conditions of release. Is it home confinement? Is it moving them to another secure place where people can be held in single rooms as opposed to triple and quadruple bunked rooms? So that's what we're asking for. And the bottom line is that we don't have the death penalty in Minnesota. We got rid of the death penalty over 100 years ago. And people who are locked up and incarcerated in prison and jails should not face a death sentence simply because they're in that facility. And unfortunately, we're running out of time to ensure that incarcerated folks all around our state are kept healthy and safe. Just yesterday, the news broke that Beltrami County Jail had a person who tested positive for the virus. And so we've got to do something to reduce populations all around the state. And we're working on Moose Lake right now, and hopefully that can be a model for what other facilities do.
Thank you. I remember when we posted it on Facebook, we got a lot of these types of comments, which is, why should we let people out of jail who have committed crimes who may have the coronavirus? Isn't a jail a good and easy place to keep people quarantined and away from the broader community?
So this is a very common question, and we've heard prosecutors even arguing that people are safer in jail. And I go back to being in jail should not be a death sentence, number one. But let's dig deeper on that. So people who are incarcerated and who are sick, they pose a threat to every other person in that facility. They're all breathing the same air. They're using the same bathrooms. They're using the same showers, the same phones, all of those things. And so it's impossible to contain the spread of COVID-19 in that congregate living setting. And so they're not safer. And you might think, well, that's just other people who are also committed crimes, so what's the big deal? But even if you don't have the basic humanity to care about the safety of people who are locked up, think about the broader community, because prisons and jails are not contained, they're not completely self-contained. There are staff going in and out of those facilities every day. And that we know that with this virus, that people can be asymptomatic. And so you could have staff going in and out every day, not showing symptoms, but spreading that virus throughout the community. And so that poses a danger to every member of the community. There are also, people who are sick and in the facility. If we increase the number of people who get sick, we are going to just increase the number of people who need to be hospitalized. And the more cases that we see in those facilities, the more likely it's going to be that local hospitals in those communities are overwhelmed by those cases. And if that happens, the whole community is going to suffer, because we've only got limited resources. Lastly, I had one more thing and now I can't remember it. I can't remember. And you're probably hearing my dog's evening serenade, so I apologize.
It's all good. I heard the dog and I was like, this is precious. I guess he wants some screen time, but yep. We're going to go on to the next question, which is, what should the state be doing to protect people who are uniquely vulnerable to the virus, including immigrants and people who are incarcerated?
Well, we absolutely need to protect medically vulnerable people who are incarcerated. The ACLU nationally released a report just yesterday. It's on the ACLU website, aclu.org. And that report is based on public health modeling, and it estimates that we could be looking at over 100,000 deaths of incarcerated people throughout the country if we don't do something to prevent the spread of COVID-19 in prisons and jails. 100,000 people just in those facilities and throughout the community. So many local jails throughout the state have already done a good job at reducing their populations. They've moved people to home confinement, they've reduced bail and used other strategies to reduce their populations so that they're no longer double bunking. and they've done other things. Both Hennepin and Ramsey County have been able to cut their numbers by a significant amount to prevent that double bunking. And those, that is a key element to allowing people to maintain physical distancing. But we still need to do more. There's still a number of workhouses in the state that have high populations, people who are double bunked, and we would like to see other counties following the lead of Ramsey County, where a judge issued an order, delegated authority to the sheriff to reduce the population of the workhouse, either by moving people to home confinement or by making sure that people's sentences could be finished up after the emergency passes. So we need to do the same for correctional facilities, and we need to do that in immigrant detention. One other thing that we need to see more of is actual testing by prisons and by jails. So if you go on the Moose Lake or on the Department of Corrections website right now, they have a spreadsheet that details the number of tests that people have been given and what those results were. And that's a great piece of transparency. We'd love to see every jail in the state do the same thing so that we know whether or not people are being tested for the virus. But one thing that you see when you look at the numbers for the Department of Corrections is for a population of 10,000 people. I confess I haven't looked at the number today, but the other day it was less than 100 people had been tested throughout that entire population. That's nowhere near enough for us to know whether or not people are a danger and a risk to others. So we need to do more testing, and we need to have testing in every facility.
Definitely. And to our viewers out there, this is the final call for questions. So please drop any of your coronavirus and your rights questions in the comments, and we will get to them towards the end. But make sure, because we're watching you. And the next question will be, what are my rights as an essential worker?
You know, we've been getting a lot.
What if my employer is putting my health at risk or not following proper procedures?
We've been getting that question a lot. Unfortunately, this is not really an area of expertise for us. We sue the government for violating people's constitutional rights, and the questions about essential workers and their rights and their health really fall under more general employment law issues, and just not something that we have expertise on. I do encourage people who feel like their employment rights are violated to look at the state's Department of Labor and Industry and the Minnesota Attorney General's office, or seek out a private employment lawyer to address their issues.
Yes. And what if an essential worker gets stopped by law enforcement while they're on the way to work? What should they do?
So this is really an important question, because we've been hearing a lot, especially from immigrants who are essential workers and who carpool. They fear that police are going to target them for enforcement of the stay-at-home order. And we do have a downloadable card on our website that has some really useful general information about what to do if you're stopped by the police, if you're stopped in your vehicle, or if police approach you on the street. Now, that card was done way before the pandemic, and so it doesn't have information specific to the current pandemic, but it does have helpful information that I would tell people right now as well. Anything that you say to police can be used against you. We usually encourage people to ask for an attorney and say as little as possible when police are questioning them, and to ask if you're free to leave. You might want to consider whether or not to provide the police with details about why you're traveling. But given that violating the stay-at-home order is a misdemeanor crime, you do still have the right to remain silent. You have the right not to be a witness against yourself. The other advice that I would give is to never lie to the police. That it can be a crime in and of itself, and so you don't want to make things worse for yourself if you are stopped by the police. But I would, download that card, and there's a lot of really good advice on it that we don't really have time to get into here.
Totally. And today is the first day of Ramadan, and it's caused a bit of a controversy because the call to prayer will be amplified from the mosque. Is that legal?
That we've been getting that question a lot over the last couple days, and a lot of the people who've reached out to us and asked questions about the fact that there's a mosque in Minneapolis that's going to be broadcasting the call to prayer have been really tinged with a lot of Islamophobic rhetoric and anti-Muslim hate. Some people are genuinely curious, others are spreading hateful messages. It doesn't help. Some of the news stories about this issue were a little misleading. I had seen one headline that said something like the city and the mosque had a partnership to broadcast the calls to prayer. If a city was broadcasting religious messages, that would be a problem. That would probably violate the Establishment Clause. But that's not the case here. So what's happening is that, like many cities, Minneapolis has a noise ordinance, and anybody, person or group that wants to exceed the noise limits of the ordinance has to get a permit. The city granted a noise permit to a mosque that will allow them to broadcast the call to prayer 5 times a day during the month of Ramadan. So that is what happened. The city granted a noise permit. And if you think about living in a city and all of the noises that you hear every day, jackhammers, construction noise, outdoor concerts, this is not unlike those other noise permits. So the loud ringing of church bells, Basilica Block Party, all of those things probably needed a noise permit. So this is no different from that. And as long as the city is treating the mosque in the same way that they would treat any other applicant for a noise permit, there's not any legal issue. Some people have said, well, the call to prayer is different than church bells because the call to prayer includes a spoken prayer that people then hear. But the city doesn't and cannot look at the content of the noise, the proposed noise, when they're deciding whether or not to grant a noise permit. So, they couldn't say to a church, you can ring bells, randomly, but you can't ring to the tune of Amazing Grace. They couldn't do that. And so just like that, they can't grant a noise permit and for some people and then deny a permit because it's too religious or that it's a religion that people find offensive. So I think the city acted appropriately here. They granted a noise permit and they're treating the mosque just like any other applicant.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And this question just came through on Facebook and it says, what is going to happen to undocumented immigrants that are detained in Sherburne County Jail?
So we are very concerned about immigrant populations, especially people who are in detention and who, many of them are suffering prolonged detention. So far, the federal courts in Minnesota have declined to release even medically vulnerable folks who are in federal custody, based on the conclusion that because there aren't any actual cases identified in any of those facilities, and the facilities have said, we've got all these plans, we're doing magnificently at keeping people safe, so there's no problem. The federal courts have said there's no compelling reason to require people to be released. Recall what I said earlier about testing and the fact that we don't know really how many people have even been tested in Sherburne County Jail, for example, or in Candy, Ohio, or Freeborn, there's several other facilities throughout the state. We don't know if anybody's been tested. And so the fact that nobody has tested positive, that's really of no consequence if nobody's been tested. So what we know from public health experts is that once it reaches a facility, at that point, it's almost too late. So we are pushing for the release of one individual. We have filed a petition on behalf of a medically vulnerable person in Candy, Ojai County, and we are hopeful that the court will grant her release, and that it will that will be a model for other folks who are medically vulnerable to also get released. There is also a petition that was filed by a group of immigrants in Sherburne County, and the court appointed an attorney for them, and so they are being represented. The court heard arguments on Tuesday in that case, and we'll have to wait and see what the federal court does. My hope is that, like some of the courts around the country, they recognize that this bright line of a positive confirmed case in a facility is not a bright line at all, and that once you've got that case, it's too late, and you should be acting right now to release vulnerable people.
And I want to circle back to the question on enforcement. We hear this a lot. If you don't arrest people, how can we compel people to follow the law?
Well, again, you can do other things short of arrest. And most of the people who so far have been cited have been, just like a speeding ticket or just like other misdemeanors. The way that enforcement works is that people are cited and released. And so, again, we don't think that people should face criminal charges unless absolutely necessary. But just, that is how most misdemeanor charges work, is that you're not taking somebody into custody. You are giving them a citation and requiring them to respond to it at some point. So again, I think, just like the police issue warnings for speeding violations, just like they issue warnings for transit fare enforcement and do education and tell people to disperse. There's all kinds of police activity that can be aimed at getting people to comply without locking them up in a jail cell. And so that's what they should be doing.
Yes. And one more question. It just came from the Facebook Live. How could this situation impact the census and voting? And after this, seriously, there are no more new questions. So yeah.
Wow. Okay. So I'm going to talk for 5:12. Okay. So how can it affect the census? That is really challenging. And because we know that the census is what is going to set our next 10 years and what our representation is over the next 10 years and what kinds of federal dollars come into Minnesota. And so it is absolutely critical that we have a complete count. And that makes it very difficult when people are in a situation where you're fearful. You certainly don't want to answer the door. And I have to confess, I don't know if the stay-at-home order has exempted census workers from going door to door to get that information. But it is going to be very challenging to get a complete count because of the health situation. And so I think it's all the more important for all of us to, check in with the people that we know and make sure that they've filled out their census forms. The election is even more challenging. So we, voting in person right now is incredibly dangerous. We saw in Wisconsin that people had to vote in person. Physical distancing was very difficult. There were very long lines and very long waits for people to vote. And so it's absolutely a problem. And if we, as some public health officials are suggesting, that we're going to see a second wave in the fall, that could arrive just in time for the election and cause issues. Now, our Constitution says that the election has to take place on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. And so the Constitution requires that. There is no postponing of the election. That's not an option. And I think we would fight that if the president wanted to postpone the election. So that's just not an option. But we can do things that make it easier for people to vote. For example, people who are already registered could receive absentee ballots automatically, so that not even having to request them. And that's something that I know our Secretary of State is working on getting through the legislature. And there are other states that are moving in that way, in that process as well. The ACLU of Texas was successful in getting a court order requiring people to be allowed to vote by mail. And there has been litigation around the country trying to make sure that absentee voting is as easy as possible for people, so that they can vote from home and stay at home. And I think that is absolutely critical, especially if we are if we see a second round. And August is when the Minnesota primary is. Where I'm really worried is with respect to Minnesota's same-day registration. We have some really great laws that allow people to register to vote on the day of the election. And we have a lot of people who use that, people who otherwise would not be able to vote because they've moved before the cutoff for other registration. And so people who are not already registered to vote in Minnesota, I think it's going to be much more difficult to get folks registered and to expand the vote. And so I think that's going to be a really big challenge that we all need to address. And so if you see new people moving into the neighborhood, encourage them to register to vote online. We have online registration to get that registration taken care of early, and do everything we can to make sure that people get registered who aren't registered already. It's going to be a challenge, and we all need to play our part.
Thank you, Terry. And finally, the last question we got is, I'm guessing this is from a person, what can we do about discrimination generally, but also during this pandemic?
So a few things. So personally, if you are the victim of discrimination and you are the victim of government action that discriminates, you should contact the ACLU. We have on our website, we have an online intake form that you can fill out, and we will look at it and see if it's something that we can help you with. If you are facing discrimination by a private entity, by your employer, or by a public accommodation or a grocery store, for example, you can contact the Minnesota Department of Human Rights and file a complaint with them for discrimination. And if you are, there are also other organizations around that handle things like this. So the Council on American Islamic Relations of Minnesota, CARE Minnesota, handles discrimination complaints that are based on discrimination based on Muslim status. And so you can contact CARE Minnesota, and they will also pursue claims on behalf of people who've experienced discrimination. But every community member has an obligation, I think, to speak out against discrimination that you are seeing in the community. With this pandemic, there has been a really disturbing rise in hate incidents, and especially hate against Asians, Asian Americans. And that is completely unacceptable. And we need to speak out and call it out when we hear it and when we see it. We need to make sure that we live in a community that we want to see, and not one that is filled with hate. And so we all have an obligation to speak out. and speak out online too when people are spewing hate as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Terry, for sitting and answering all of our questions. And we just want to remind everyone in the audience that we will be doing this for the foreseeable future on Thursdays at 4:30 p.m. So tune in to ask your COVID-19 related questions. So there'll be different folks, so maybe someone from the organizing team or someone from the policy team, but just follow us on social media and keep track of what we're doing. If you want to know specifically the actions we're taking daily, check out our COVID-19 resource timeline. And I want to say thank you to all the members and donors. If you're watching or if you're going to watch this later, we could not do the work that we do without you. Everyone from me on the communications team to Terry on the legal team. So thank you so much. And with that, I'm going to wrap up and say good night.
Thanks, everyone.